My name is Gary Hamel. Since 1983, I've been on the faculty of the London Business School. I'm also the executive director of the Management Innovation Exchange. This is the world's first open innovation initiative focused on reinventing management, and you can find that at hackmanagement.com. Over all these decades that I've been thinking and working with organizations, I really had one focus. How do we create organizations that are truly fit for the future? As we understand that the future is less and less going to be an extrapolation of the past. And I think the key to creating organizations that are fit for the future is creating organizations that are truly fit for human beings. And I'd like to start by asking you to reflect on a question for a moment. If you had to make a list of the greatest inventions of the last century, the things that have changed our lives that we could hardly imagine living without, what would be the things you'd put on your list? I'm sure you'd have the combustion engine there, semiconductors, all the wonderful pharmaceuticals that we enjoy today, probably the internet, long list of things that have made our lives easier, have made them more fun, and I think, all of those things are important. Having said that, I would argue the single most important invention of the last 100 years was the invention of management. And that sounds maybe a little bit weird. We don't usually think about management as an invention, but if you think about the tools, the methods that we use to bring people together, to mobilize and organize resources for productive ends, that was an invention. The fact that today you have a digital device in every pocket, that you're not spending 80% of your time growing your own food, that you can travel anywhere around the world on a ticket that costs hardly anything. All of those are gifts. They're the bounty of an invention, a set of inventions about 100 years ago where we learned how to bring human beings together to do things at scale with ever-improving productivity. And we are all the happy recipients of all the wonderful things that have come from the invention of management. And yet I'm going to argue that we're going to have to now reinvent management. The way we lead, we plan, we organize, we hire, we motivate. All of those things we're going to have to reinvent because today organizations are facing a set of challenges that are truly unprecedented. And I hope I can also convince you maybe that management is actually kind of exciting. I have to say, I don't think I've ever met a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old who says they want to grow up to be a manager. So if you end up in that situation, it clearly means you took a wrong turn somewhere along the meandering path of life, right? You missed the off-ramp to be a smoke jumper or to be an ocean explorer, a jet fighter pilot. And yet this technology is so incredibly important. Indeed, it sets the outer boundaries on what we can do as a species. And we manage all the time, whether it's a church bake sale, whether it's getting a few friends together for a dinner party. Anytime we bring people together, we have to coordinate, organize. That's the work of managing. And I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that this is the technology of human accomplishment. And now it needs to be reinvented. But let me give you another kind of thought experiment to think about for a minute. I'd like you to imagine that you're in the following situation. That you're the CEO of a new startup. You've raised a few $1 million of venture capital money. You have a wonderful new technology, a patent, something you think you can parlay into a great global business. And you've hired a small initial team, maybe a dozen folks that you hope are going to build this company with you. And as you sit there as the CEO in this new company, you have a clean sheet of paper. You can build this company any way you like. And maybe, a few years ago, you were working in some bigger corporation. And in your job there were things that really bugged you. You were upset by how long it took to get a decision, how certain things were so political, how change just happened, so slowly and with so much kind of pain and agony. And you're determined in this new organization to do things differently. You want an organization that's nimble, that's an exciting place to work, that doesn't have any politicking going on, and you're the boss, and you have this clean sheet of paper. So put yourself in that situation for a moment and ask yourself, what kind of a management process, what kind of management systems would you put in place there? How are you going to set priorities? How are you going to allocate your resources? What kind of roles are you going to give to people? What kind of decision-making rules are you going to have? Because you can really do anything you want here. And as you think about that scenario, that challenge, right, how are you going to put in place the management model that will drive this thing into a big global company? Here's my question for you. Can you imagine a set of management processes and methods and so on in that new young organization that are fundamentally different than the one you'd find in, some sclerotic old big company? And the answer for most people is they have a very hard time imagining, even when you give them the chance, a fundamentally different way of managing than what we find around us right now in traditional hidebound organizations. Very difficult to imagine radical alternatives to the management status quo. I live in the middle of Silicon Valley, so I get to see a lot of young companies. They have amazing new business models, new technologies, but most of them have borrowed their management practices from large traditional companies where many of those folks used to work. And those practices are scaled down, right? There's not quite so much bureaucracy. It doesn't take so much time to get things done. But they're really not very different than what you'd find in any large Fortune 500 Global 1000 company. So I'd like us to think for a moment, why is it so difficult to imagine dramatically different, dramatically new ways of leading, managing, organizing? And I think one of the reasons, if I can say it, one of the reasons this is so hard is it's hard to imagine how something could change that has for so long been unchanged. And if you think about management as a technology, I described it earlier as the technology of human accomplishment. It is a set of social technologies. That technology was invented more than 100 years ago. In fact, let me give you just a little bit of history here. Go back with me for a moment to 1890, about 120 years ago. And if you had been living in America, Germany, Britain, and what we called the developed world at the time, in 1890, you would have found that about 90% of people were still in agriculture. The average manufacturing company would have had less than 4 employees. So it's very fragmented, very small organizations. That was the world circa 1890. And over the next, literally one generation, all of that would change. By 1915, 25 years later, Ford Motor Company is making more than 500,000 automobiles a year. U.S. Steel has become the first company in the world that has a billion-dollar market capitalization. And in that tiny sliver of time, in one generation, almost all the tools of modern management get invented. Pay for performance, capital budgeting, task design, divisionalization, brand management, all the management tools and methods that you find yet today in organizations around the world, virtually all of those were invented before 1920. And most of them were invented by individuals who were born in the middle of the 19th century. That's what we can call Management 1.0. And most organizations are still running on Management 1.0. Very few organizations around the world today would be happy if they had a 1970s telephone system or a 1980s computer system, but we are literally running our organization on the practices, the principles that go back more than 100 years. And so indeed, I think if we could somehow, if we could wake up maybe let's say a 1960s era CEO, and we brought them back to life, we put them back in the executive suite, certainly there are things that would surprise them. They'd be surprised by the pace of change. They'd be surprised by the 24/7 world we live in, by all the information they have at their fingertips. But there is much they would find reassuring. They would find that in that organization, big leaders still appoint little leaders. The budgeting process works like it always has. People bid their ideas up, compete for resources. Somebody up at the top of the organization makes the big calls about where we're going to invest. They would find that your share of voice in that organization is still largely dependent on where you sit in the hierarchy. And in fact, this technology of management, not only has it not changed much over the last 100 years, it varies very little from organization to organization. It is truly kind of a global standard technology. It's why, as a leader, you can move from one organization to another, from one industry to another, and find that most of the levers and dials of management are going to be in the same places. Jorma Ollila, which for years was the chairman of Nokia, becomes then the chairman of Shell, the great big oil company. And, how can somebody do that? One country to another, one industry to another, because the way Shell manages itself is not that different from the way Nokia manages itself. So I think that's why it is so hard to imagine an alternative. In fact, if you were going to plot the evolution of management over this last 100 years, it would follow kind of a classic technology S-curve. Right? A lot of innovation 100 years ago, a lot of new thinking, and then over time, slowly, that pace of evolution slows down. And in our working lifetimes, indeed, if you go back 50, 60 years ago, the way we manage has hardly changed at all. So in many senses, the management principles, the tools, the methods that we find in our organizations, these are legacies, these are hand-me-downs from gurus, from ex-CEOs, from management thinkers who are mostly long dead, long retired, or long in the tooth, and yet it is their view of management that is still driving our organizations. And I think we need to change this. I think it's time to change this, and I'd like to talk a little bit about why. Why worry? Why think about innovating around management? We're all very familiar when we think about innovation in terms of products, right? The latest new flat screen television, mobile phone, new drug. We understand that. We get innovation in business models, in strategy. Facebook would be an example, or IKEA a few decades ago, or Dell, whole new business models, new ways of competing. Increasingly today, we also see innovation in industry architectures, not just one company with an interesting new business model, but we see companies that are pulling apart entire industries. This is what Apple did in the music industry. It's not about the iPad. It's about all the music companies, the standards, the iPad, the distribution, iTunes, a whole new ecosystem there. And all of those sorts of innovation are really, really important. But when you look over the last 100 years and you ask yourself the simple question, what has driven enduring and fundamental shifts in competitive advantage? What explains how industry leadership shifted, for example, from Ford to General Motors to Toyota and maybe now somewhere else? How do you account for those sea changes in competitive advantage? What you discover is the explanation for that is really less about products, it's less about strategy, and it's more about innovation in management itself. Innovation that created organizations that were fundamentally more capable than the ones that came before. Let me give you a few examples. If we went back about 105 years now, early part of the 20th century, and we visited the labs of Edison. Edison was working with General Electric, Thomas Edison, to invent the world's first R&D laboratories. Now, people have been doing science for a long time before that, back to Copernicus and earlier. But this was the first time we really tried to apply management principles to the business of scientific discovery. And Edison and his team were so successful that he could say, we will now create a minor breakthrough every 6 weeks, a major breakthrough every 6 months, and within a couple of decades, General Electric would have more patents than any other company in the world. That was an extraordinary management innovation, bringing management discipline to the business of scientific discovery. A few years later, General Motors was kind of coming apart at the seams. It had been built through a series of acquisitions. It was a large, chaotic empire. And the chairman at the time, Pierre DuPont, he turned to a young staffer, Alfred Sloan. He said, I don't think we're getting any economies of scale or scope. This is a hard thing to manage. Help me bring some order to this sprawling empire. And the idea that Alfred Sloan came back with was the notion of the divisionalized organization. We're going to divide this complex thing up into separate divisions. We'll have central strategy, central financial controls, decentralized operations. We will even let these divisions, Chevrolet and Buick and Cadillac and so on, we will let them compete against each other. That was a radical idea. But that was a way of getting some order in complexity. And that idea of the divisionalized organization would kind of trickle down to almost every other organization around the world. Virtually every company today, somewhere inside of them, they have some General Motors management DNA. Unfortunately, that was the last time that General Motors was a management innovator, almost a century ago. Never again did they bring that kind of inspiration to the question of how do we lead, how do we organize? Go forward another 30 or 40 years and the story turns to Toyota. How did this company become the world's largest manufacturer of cars? One of Toyota's great management innovations, recognizing that they had fewer people, fewer resources than their big European and American competitors, one of their great innovations was turning ordinary employees into inspired problem solvers. And today this innovation sounds, maybe not very bold, but I can tell you it was a radical break from the past. They took employees who had 10 or 12 years of education. They taught them about statistical process control, Pareto analysis. They taught them how to identify problems on the production line. They gave them the power to stop that production line cold if they saw something that needed to be fixed. And it would take Toyota's American, European competitors a generation to really figure out what Toyota had done. Last year in Japan, Toyota's Japanese employees came up with more than 500,000 suggestions for improvement. Every day they simply get more ideas out of their people than any of their competitors get out of theirs. But that was a dramatic kind of reassignment of power down in the organization. It challenged the notion in companies like Ford and GM that the plant managers and the supervisors, those were the people who fixed the problems. Those were the people who were in control. And that's what made it so difficult. It took them so long to understand that this was a fundamentally different philosophy of management. Come forward another few decades, and we have a great management innovation called open source software. Think about this. If we go back maybe just a decade, if we had polled CEOs in large companies around the world, and we'd ask them, do you believe that within a few years it will be possible for a disparate army of volunteers all over the world with nothing in the way of formal management structure or processes, those people will be able to come together and create something as complex as a computer operating system with millions of lines of code that has to work together flawlessly, seamlessly? How many business leaders a few years ago would have said, yeah, that's obvious, that's going to happen? Not very many, I think. A few years ago, a young engineer in Microsoft, Villapindi was his name, he wrote a memo that would become quite famous across Microsoft, kind of looking at this new way of producing software, open source. And in his note, he said, for the first time, Microsoft is not competing with another product. We're not even competing with another company. We are competing with a different philosophy. And what I'm going to argue today is that we're at a point in business history where we not only need better practices, we need better principles. We need fundamentally new ways of thinking about how we bring people together and so on. And yet, this is so difficult to do. Could you imagine for a moment, could you imagine an organization in which every employee rates their boss and their boss's boss, and all of those ratings are visible online? Everybody can see that. No place for a bad manager to hide. Could you imagine an organization in which every employee has the right to say no to any request? That nobody can compel another human being to do something they don't want to do. Can you imagine a company that takes its strategy, the core kind of set of decisions about where do we go next, and you crowdsource that? You invite thousands of outsiders to help you develop your strategy. Where should we go in the future as an organization? Can you imagine a company that has no formal hierarchy, no titles, no kind of, EVP, SVP, department heads, big company where everybody is on the same level? I think we have a hard time even imagining such realities. But every one of those things, every one of those little examples I just gave you, this is something that's being done right now. It's something that is real, and you find these in some of the world's most sophisticated companies. So yeah, I think it's possible to reinvent management. I think we have to do it. I think we have to challenge the most fundamental assumptions we have. And if history is any guide, there are enormous rewards when you do this. Even when you go back and look at military history, and you ask kind of the same question, why is it at different periods of time that certain armies, certain navies enjoyed long periods of military superiority? How do you explain that? Most of us, I think, if we were thinking about that, our first explanation would really be around weapons. We might say the English back there in the 13th, 14th century, the Yew-wood longbow. Or we might have, pointed to a particular strategy, the blitzkrieg of the German army. But when you go back, even in military history, and you try to explain these large, enduring shifts, Again, you come back to innovation in management and organization. The British invention of the regimental structure. How was it that Britain was able to rule the Indian subcontinent for almost 300 years? Or you look at in Europe when Napoleon brought together for the first time an army that was composed of citizens that were fighting not for some distant monarch, but for the glory of France. So again and again, whether it's military, whether it's business, you see how important this is. And what I'm going to argue today is that it's now more important than ever. So let me talk about why. Why is that the case? What are these new challenges that lie outside the performance envelope of our old management model? And I'd like to focus particularly on 3 challenges, and in each case I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about a vanguard organization that is innovating deeply around management in ways that is helping them to tackle these challenges. So 3 challenges, 3 examples of modern-day management pioneers. So I think the first challenge that we face today, which is truly unprecedented, we are literally the first generation in history that is having to cope with an inflection point in the pace of change. Literally, change has changed, and it's changed in our lifetimes. We live in a world today that seems like it's all punctuation and very little equilibrium. Change is seditious, it's unrelenting, it's ever surprising. But think about this for a moment. Think about kind of an exponential curve. Imagine just an exponential curve. And think about the things in our world right now that are changing at an exponential pace. Just think about that for a moment. What things are changing at an exponential pace? CO2 emissions, they're going up at an exponential pace. The number of internet connections in the world, on that same curve. The amount of data storage out there, same curve. Number of mobile devices connected to the web, also going up on that kind of a curve. The number of genes that we've sequenced, also on that kind of a curve. And I can tell you, if you go back 100 years ago, there was nothing that was changing at an exponential pace. This is entirely new. And it is challenging us as individuals, as institutions, as societies to change much faster or simply become irrelevant. And the data already suggests that most organizations are not up to this new challenge. Let me just share a little bit of data with you. We know as a fact that the year-to-year volatility in earnings for companies, that volatility is going up. And it's been going up for several decades now. To put it another way, this year's earnings are becoming a poorer and poorer predictor of next year's earnings as the environment around us becomes more turbulent. We know that industry leadership is changing hands more often. One little case study. Let's just take 1 minute here. You go back to the early 1980s, Motorola invents the mobile phone. You know, big as a house brick, but still an amazing invention. Their assumption is this is going to be a tool for business people. It's expensive. It's kind of an elite product. About a decade later, early 1990s, the folks at Nokia start to ask the question, could we turn the mobile phone into a lifestyle device? Can we make this the next Sony Walkman, right? This is way before iPod. Can we make this the Walkman? And sure enough, by driving costs down, making a very simple design, Nokia is able to blanket the world with mobile phones. They end up with close to 40% market share, become the new global leader. A few years later, a Canadian company, RIM, says, why don't we make this thing a mobile office? We'll put your contacts, your email. There, thus is born the BlackBerry, becomes kind of indispensable tool for every business person. And then, of course, a few years ago, Apple comes with the iPhone. And says, now we're going to turn this into a mobile computing platform, 300,000 apps at last count. So literally in 20 years, leadership in that industry has changed 4 times. And that's not unusual these days. Just being a leader now tells me nothing about whether you're going to be a leader 3 or 4 or 5 years hence. In fact, the world is filled with organizations right now, like Motorola, that have lost their mojo. Right? They've kind of fallen behind, missed a turn in the road. So one of the challenges I think we have to face today is how do we build organizations that have an evolutionary advantage? that aren't just good at a point in time, but are able to evolve over time.